With a bit of background about my materials and my teaching style in case you've not yet attended one of my presentations. I do try to accommodate you no matter what version of Excel you might be using, which could be Excel 2007, 10, 13, or 16. For the material I'm covering today, everything works and looks and feels the same way across all 4 versions. Lots of my presentations I'll be covering techniques that have been, or features that have been added in the newest versions of Excel. But for this set of materials, we'll be able to do everything across all 4 versions of Excel. There is one command if you happen to be using Excel for Mac that's not available, and I'll bring that to your attention when we get to it. I will be demonstrating everything at least twice today. We'll first walk you through it on the PowerPoint slides, which are very detailed and have numbered steps. Then I will go over to Excel 2016 and carry out those techniques firsthand. The handouts for today, which hopefully you've been provided, do include the example workbook that has most of the examples I'll be teaching from, as well as a PDF of the presentation. If by chance you do not receive those, you can send an email to ask@davidringstrom.com, and I'll be happy to share them with you. The example workbook also includes a related articles tab that has linked to articles I've written that relate to today's material. So I do try to leave you with a lot of takeaways in choosing one of my presentations. Let's take a look at what our game plan for today is. We're going to have a worksheet that has 4 tabs. We'll be spending a lot of time on the Inputs tab and the Supporting Schedules tab, less time on the Operating Budget and Cash Budget. In fact, due to time constraints, we may not get to the Cash Budget tab itself. But what you're going to find is that effective spreadsheet design is much like when you go to paint an old house. Had my house painted earlier this year, and I was surprised that it took them several days of prep work, and then the final painting, the paint went on real fast. And there's some similarities here with building effective spreadsheets. We're going to find that we're going to be doing some upfront work, that if we do this upfront work, actually building the budget spreadsheet itself becomes remarkably easier because we don't have to go search for inputs. Our formulas are resilient. The other thing that we'll be spending time on is protecting the formulas so that we don't have situations where users can type over the amounts and compromise the budget. So the Inputs tab is where we're going to have everything that the user can change, and that's from a design strategy. That's a best practice because when we take inputs and scatter them all throughout the workbook, it becomes kind of an Easter egg hunt within the spreadsheet, trying to figure out where to find the settings. But also we're going to find that we can then lock down the other tabs that have formulas on them, and there won't be anything for the user to change. So the Supporting Schedules tab is going to have calculations. They're going to detail everything that goes into the budget so that by the time we get to the Operating Budget tab, it's just a matter of summarizing the information into a budget form because we'll already have done all the heavy lifting. So let me pull up the spreadsheet and just kind of orient you with where we're headed today. Here are our inputs, and these are all things that the user can change. The Supporting Schedules tab will be filling in all these blue blanks. These will be various calculations that will allow us to perform allocations and also calculate amounts that we'll need in our budget. The Operating Budget then will basically just be pulling things together, and there won't be a black box aspect to this budget, which there can be with many, because everything will all be detailed. So actually the budget tab itself is just simply going to pull the numbers together so that we can tally things up. We'll also be looking at techniques we can use to improve the integrity of when we're summing data. Many times users create sum functions in such a fashion that if you insert a new row at the top or bottom of a section, that new data gets left out of the total. That then causes errors in our budget. So we'll see ways to get around that as well. The cash budget, if we have time at the end, we'll spend some time building that out, but typically it will consume most of the presentation getting the first 3 tabs put together. The first feature that I want to bring to your attention, or first concept, is the concept of assigning names to our inputs in our spreadsheets. And we're going to find that there's going to be 2 different approaches for assigning these names. There's kind of a bulk approach that we can use when we have a number of assumptions that are all grouped together. But then other situations, we will need to assign these names individually. So to begin, I want to bring your attention to what's known as the name box. That's that little section, a little rectangle in Excel that's right above the worksheet frame. And many users think that the main purpose for the name box is simply to glance up there and determine the address of the cell that you're currently in. There's actually 36 different activities that we can carry out in that space. And so we won't see all 36 today, but we will make use of a few of them. And so for most of our spreadsheets, we're going to find that if we pull down that arrow to the right of the name box, that list will be empty because most of us are not using range names within our spreadsheets. So we'll start out by assigning names to these assumptions, and we're going to find that doing this simple step is going to help us in a couple ways. One, names that we assign become bookmarks. So once we've gone through the process of creating these names, we go return back and pull down the name box, we're going to find that we can choose any name from that list and jump right to that worksheet cell. And we'll be able to do that from anywhere within our budget spreadsheet. Many times budget spreadsheets are particularly large, and if we need to change an assumption or review an assumption, we can spend a lot of time just trying to figure out where that assumption is. If we've assigned names to our assumptions, then we can just jump right to it, and then I'll also show you how we can return back to the cell that we were in previously. So we'll be able to round trip our way purposefully through our spreadsheet rather than having to go on a spelunking expedition trying to find what we need. So to assign these names here, the first step is we're going to select cells A2 through B9 on the inputs worksheet. From there, once we've selected that block of cells, step 3, we will go to the formulas menu, and then step 4, the command we'll click on is called create from selection. This is how we can get Excel to assign the names for us. So that brings up a create names from selection dialog box. And you'll notice that when this comes up on the screen, that the checkbox is already filled in for left column. What that signifies is that we wish to take the words from the left column of our selection and assign them as names to the cells on the right-hand side of our selection there. So that's why we've selected a 2-column block of cells. When we click OK, it may seem as if nothing really happened, but as you see by step 6, if we go back to the name box, pull down that menu, we'll then see that names have been assigned to the cells in column B. Thus, we have the bookmarking mechanism I talked about, but also we're going to find that when we reference these cells in our formulas, we'll see the names in our formulas there as well, as opposed to simply seeing cell addresses. That means if we're trying to audit the budget spreadsheet, we don't have to go chase down random cell addresses. We'll be able to tell at a glance exactly what input was used and make sure that we, as we go to verify our work. To see this in Excel, if I were to go click on the name box, presently it's empty. No names have been assigned in this spreadsheet. So I'm going to select cells A2 through B9. I'll go to Excel's Formulas menu. And on the Formulas menu, I'm going to click the choice for Create from Selection. So when I click that, it brings up the Create Names from Selection dialog box. Defaults to the left column, so I will then click OK. So this moment, it's hard to tell that anything particularly happened, but one, notice how if I'm in cell A2, it says A2, but when I go to B2, there's now a name there. It says First Month Sales. So that's how I can tell, I can distinguish the cells that have names assigned to them. If I go up to the name box and notice that here are the list of names that have been assigned. Now let me illustrate this navigation method here. Let's say that I were on the cash budget spreadsheet. And in fact, just to kind of orient us, I'm going to make cell A25 be yellow. So that's where my cursor presently is. So let's say I wanted to jump to one of the assumptions. I can pull down the list here. If I want to change the interest rate or review the interest rate, I can click on that. Excel takes me to the inputs worksheet and puts me on the interest rate cell. So I was able to purposefully move right to that individual location of the spreadsheet. Now to return to where I previously was, if I go to the Find and Select command on the Home menu, we'll then see that there's a Go To command. Now, one of the things that can be a bit daunting and sometimes frustrating about Excel is that there are often 2 or 3 ways to carry out every task in Excel. This is one of those situations where there's actually 3 different ways to get to the Go To dialog box. We could, as I showed you, go to the Home menu and then click on Find and Select. Or if we hover over that, notice there's a keyboard shortcut of Control-G. There's also a second keyboard shortcut. This command's kind of an overachiever. We could also press the F5 key. So any of those 3 methods will bring up the Go To dialog box. Notice that in the reference field, it remembered that previously I was in cell A25 of the cash budget worksheet. So if I click OK, I'm returned to that spot. So that's how I can then round trip my way in my spreadsheet by choosing a range name. I'm able to hop directly to that input, and then I can easily get back to the location where I was working. So to show you that again, let's say if we went instead to the sales price assumption. We click on the sales price from our list here. It takes me to the sales price worksheet cell. Once again, I can either go to Find and Select and choose Go To, or press Control-G or F5, any of those methods. When I click on that, brings up the Go To dialog box. I was in cell A25, so I click OK, returns me back to the location that I was in. So that's one major benefit that we're going to find of range names. And many times our assumptions will be laid out, we'll be able to name them all at once. However, we can also have names that are a bit different where we'll need to assign the names individually. And so that's where we can make a different use of the name box to actually assign the name on the fly there. So to begin, step 1, we're going to click on cell B12 of the inputs worksheet. Step 2, we're going to type the word Collections 1 in the name box, and then we're going to press Enter. When we do, that will then name that cell. So we'll repeat those steps to create Collections 2 and Collections 3, and then we'll also assign the names Payments 1, Payments 2, and Payments 3. Now, when we are manually assigning these names, a couple rules we have to abide by. Range names cannot begin with a number. They have to begin with a letter. They also cannot contain any spaces or punctuation. Because of that restriction, that's why when we used the Create from Selection command, that's why Excel replaced any spaces or punctuation with underscore characters. So when we're assigning names, we can't have spaces, but we can use underscores in lieu of spaces. Now, whenever we have anything like this that we're doing over and over again in Excel, it can be easy to slip up. So along the way, when I'm typing collections, at one point I'm going to leave the letter S out, so I call it Collection 3. And I'll show you how to overcome that, because once you put the name in incorrectly, if you go back and try to put the name in the correct way, it will appear as if your change doesn't take. In reality, the change does take, but it can be a little bit confusing, so I'll show you what to look for. So here we're in cell B12 of the inputs worksheet. I'm going to click in this space here and type in Collection 1 and press, actually Collections 1 and press Enter. Here then we'll do Collections 2, and then we'll do Collections 3. Actually, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to do it back this way. I'm going to say Collection 3. So there, I kind of goofed up. Notice if I pull down the menu, I have Collection 3 versus Collections 1 and Collections 2. So when you have a situation like that, you might think, okay, well, I'll just click back up here and I'll type it again. I'll type Collections with an S and press Enter. It will seem like it reverted back to collection and didn't take your change. In reality, the cell now has 2 different names. Notice it has Collections 3. It's also named Collection 3. So we'll see in a moment how to clean that up. With regards to payments, we can say Payments 1, Payments 2, Payments 3. So whenever you assign a name in Excel, you may at some point need to change that name or edit it in some fashion. And here's how we'll do that. Step 1 is on the Formulas menu in Excel. once we activate the formulas menu, step 2, we're going to choose the name manager. We click that button, that brings up a dialog box, which is the name manager dialog box. And an interesting thing that the name manager dialog box will let us do is allow us to get a bird's eye view of all of the assumptions in our budget spreadsheet if we're using range names. Because we're going to see that the list initially appears alphabetically, but we'll be able to sort based on clicking on the column headings and be able to view our inputs in a variety of fashions. And so by being able to achieve that change in perspective on the numbers, that can help us find, stray entries or anomalies within our budget numbers. So that's one benefit. But also we can use the name manager to delete any names that got set up incorrectly. We'll click on the name and click the delete button. We'll also be able to edit any name. So the other way to overcome things is we could edit an existing name that we typed incorrectly, correct that spelling there, or if we chose the wrong cell, we could click on a different cell and fix the name there as well. But yet, one more benefit is step 5. So notice if we go into the name dialog box and we double click on a name, that brings up the edit name dialog box. So step 4 showed that we can fix misspellings in the names if we wish. Step 6 shows we can change the cell address. But step 5 points us to the comment space. So we can put up to 255 characters in that space. And this is just a hidden location where if there's any kind of notes that you want to make about a given input in the budget spreadsheet, but you don't want it so upfront by being a cell comment, let's say, then this just gives you yet another area to store notes about an assumption. So we can't write a book, we only have 255 characters, but that can be a space where we can make some notes to ourselves that we can view by way of the name manager, but no other way in Excel. So to locate the name manager, we first go to the formulas menu, and then we're going to the name manager command. So when we click on it, it gives us a list of all of our range names. Here we can see that misspelled name that I created. So I can click on that, I can choose delete, and then click OK, and then that removes that stray name there. With regard to being able to sort things, notice if I click on the value command, sorts things in this order, so it kind of changes the order of it. I can sort it based on which worksheet it's on, and so I can also go back and sort based on the name to get things back in an alphabetical order. If I were to click on a name and double click on a name, I could then change the name of it if I wanted to fix the spelling. In the comment space, I can type up to 255 characters in that space there to make a note about that assumption if I wish. The refers to field, that's the cell that is being named, and so I can click on it and just view and make sure that I've named the proper cell. So you may not need to use the name manager very often, but it does give you a bird's eye view of all the assumptions if you've named them all. And where that can be helpful is sometimes we need to put assumptions on different worksheets, and so this gives us back a cohesive list that lists them all in one place that we'd be able to sort through if we needed to. So thus far we've assigned the names to these inputs and these inputs as well. That's going to bring us down to the operating expense section. Now, the operating expense section is a different animal, if you will, than the other inputs. The other inputs were all individual inputs that were just a single cell input. But this expenses section, we often have areas of our spreadsheet where expenses tend to grow. We need to add more expenses over time because that area needs to be resizable. So we're not going to assign individual range names to these elements here. We're going to take a different approach and use Excel's table feature here. Because for the expenses section, we'll be able to use the VLOOKUP function to find the expense name and then retrieve the amount. And what we want to set up is a situation where we can simply add a new expense item there, go over to our budget spreadsheet and insert a new row and copy the formulas and be done. We don't want to have to go back in and rewrite formulas and get in a space where we're having to rewrite formulas simply because we added a couple of new expenses. That's the kind of work that is happening at the 11th hour, and expenses get left out because someone forgets to rewrite the spreadsheet, and so we want to minimize the maintenance of our spreadsheet. So what this will look like to use the table feature in this area, what we're going to do is we're going to click on any cell within the operating expenses section there. Step 2, we'll go to the insert command. Step 3, we'll click on the table command. That will bring up a create table dialog box where Excel is going to ask us where's the data for our table. So the table feature adds a lot of enhancements to Excel. We're only going to see a small number of those enhancements today, but we'll see that it's going to be useful for building in resilience into our spreadsheet. So when we click OK, Excel will then make that part of the spreadsheet be a table. Tables grow automatically whenever we add more data either to the right or below it, so that it automatically annexes that data. Now, just like a range name, we can also assign a special name to our tables, and so that's what we'll see that when we click in the area of the spreadsheet that is a table, we'll see a design menu appear. So the design menu is going to play peekaboo. It's going to appear or disappear depending on where your cursor is. If your cursor is within the table, you'll see the design menu. So on the left-hand side of the design menu, you'll be able to assign a name such as expenses. So you'll then be able to navigate to that part of the spreadsheet as well. Now, Excel is full of little quirks, and there is a little quirk about table names here. Step 6 shows us clicking on the name manager, the name box, that menu again, pulling it down. Notice that expenses shows up below our range names. So we can navigate to it the same as if it's a range name, but it doesn't sort, it sorts separate from the range names. So if you create any table names in addition to range names, you'll need to find the table names at the bottom of the list there. Now we can see that whenever we make the data into a table, Excel changes the colors of the data. It shades every other row. And if you don't want that shading in your spreadsheet, on the design menu, you can click the corner of the styles section on that design menu, and that's step 8. Step 9 there, you'll click none to remove that shading there. If you wish to remove the table feature completely and just have this return to being just a regular range of cells, then step 10, you would optionally click convert to range and then say yes if you don't want to use the table feature anymore. So here what we'll see is we go to the insert menu, we click on the table command. This is where's the data for your table. Notice it also says my table has headers. That signifies that we have column headings at the top of our list. And you can greatly improve your experience in Excel if you take the time to put column headings at the top of every list that you have in Excel, because Excel expects those. Further, it expects them to be in a single cell, not wrapped across multiple rows. But that's what my table has headers. If we cleared that checkbox, Excel would add its own generic column headings there. But in this case, it will treat the first row as titles, which it appropriately is. So we'll click OK. So notice here, here's that design menu. So if I take my cursor and I click on cell A15, then I don't see the design menu at the top of the screen anymore. When I move my cursor back into A16, the design menu reappears. So we click on that. Over to the left here, here is our table name. So we'll put in the word expenses, and then we'll press enter. That allows us to, one, reference this area of the spreadsheet by name later on, but also to navigate to it. So once again, if we went to any cell, we'll just pick a random cell here. So this time we'll be in maybe M31. I can go pull down the name box. Expenses shows up down at the bottom of the list, such that when I click on it, Excel takes me to that part of the spreadsheet, as we saw, I can return back to my previous location by going to Find and Select, choosing Go To, clicking OK, takes me back to cell M31 where I started there. So we'll circle back in a bit and reference the expenses section there, but this lays all the groundwork for the inputs worksheet. So we'll now turn our attention to the supporting schedules worksheet and start building out these formulas. So the first formula here is going to show budgeted sales in units. And we have an input for that, which is the first month's sales. And so in cell B2 of the supporting schedules worksheet, we need to reference cell B2 from the inputs tab. But I'm not going to do it in the way that most of us would normally do that, which would be type equals and go click on the inputs worksheet and then click on cell B2. Instead, I'm going to, and notice I'm not even going to type an equal sign. I'm simply going to click on cell B2, going to go to the formulas menu. Step 3, I'm going to choose use in formula. Now, this is that command that we can use in Excel for Windows that we cannot use in Excel for Mac. It's not present in Excel for Mac, unfortunately, but I will show you a workaround that you can use. But notice that use in formula gives you a list of your named ranges. So step 4, I can choose the first month sales. Excel creates a formula there to add the equal sign for me. So step 5, all I have to do is press enter. So my resulting formula is equals first month sales, which is different than inputs exclamation mark B2. If I have a formula that's inputs exclamation mark B2, if I need to audit that, make sure that it's written correctly, I have to go to the inputs tab and go to cell B2 and then keep hopping back and forth between the sheets. And that ends up being part of that death by 1,000 cuts experience where things start blurring and we become less and less effective. If we can just glance at a cell and say first month sales and know that that's the correct assumption, we can then move on to something more productive. So here, instead of saying equals and then having to switch worksheets and then we lose all context, because notice that when we switch between the worksheets, then all of a sudden I might, if something distracts me, I'll forget which assumption I was even searching. So I have to press the escape key, get oriented again, and then try again. Let's contrast that with going to the formulas menu, choosing use in formulas, and then we come down, there is first month sales, press enter, Excel adds the equal sign, we press enter, and so there's our first formula. So that's what the formula looks like in that worksheet cell. So now we're going to add formulas to the right. We're going to assume that there'll be 10,000 units in the first month and then an additional 250 units each month as the year goes on. So we're going to write our next formula here. So we can go to cell C2 of the supporting schedules worksheet. Once again, we go to formulas, we choose use in formula. Step 4, this time around, we'll choose sales growth per month. That will build that part of the formula. We can then say plus B2 because we want to add to that the previous month's value. We can then, as step 6, use the fill handle to drag that formula across over to cell M2. So notice that when we use range names, we spend less time hopping between worksheets. We can just stay on this worksheet and choose names so we end up with formulas that are easier to understand and also easier to write. Here then in cell C2, I'm already on the formulas tab. I'll choose use in formula. I'll pick sales growth per month, do a plus sign, reference the preceding cell, and so there's my next formula. To take this formula and drag it across, I can grab this little notch that's known as the fill handle and just use that to drag across over to column M. So that then fills in all the cells going across. The next formula that we're going to need to do is the ending inventory. And so what we're going to do is the ending inventory is going to be 60% of the next month's sales. So that slide didn't make it in here, but what we'll do, we'll just write this in the same fashion. We'll say use in formula, ending inventory, so that's our percentage, multiplying that by the next month's sales. So that gives us that amount. What we'll then see is that we take that and we drag across over to here. Now, when we get out to the right here, this formula is referring to column N, and there's not a value there. So I'm going to just edit this and make it refer to cell M2. So the assumption is that the ending inventory will be 60% of the following month's sales. Which brings us then to our total needs row. So we're going to create a formula here. What we're going to do is we're going to select all 12 months. And on Excel's home menu, also on the formulas menu, is an auto sum command. The keyboard shortcut for this command is the Alt key and the equal sign. But if we click on it, because I've selected all 12 months, notice Excel fills in the sum all the way across. So what a lot of folks do is they'll do auto sum on the first cell and then they'll drag it across. If instead, if you went ahead and selected all 12 rows, and the way that I like selecting data on a spreadsheet is to hold down the Shift key while I use the arrow keys. That keeps me in control. The mouse can't get out from under me. I can then click the auto sum button. That gives me my sum there. So then what we'll do, we'll hide these formulas. And so now we're down in the beginning inventory section. So the beginning inventory is 60% of the current month's sales. So that formula will say equals ending inventory times B2. Notice that as I populate this next section, I'm not going to copy the formulas across the right because I don't really need to. I'll be able to go ahead and load up this first column, the January column, and then copy the formulas to the right all in one fell swoop. So to see what that will look like, we start out with our ending inventory number. Our required purchases in units is going to be just simple arithmetic of we taking the total needs, subtracting what we presently have on hand. The required purchases in dollars, we will say 1 minus the gross margin to figure out the cost of our item, multiply that by the sales price, multiply that by the required purchases in units. So we're able to use a use-in formula to derive this formula as well. Then for budgeted sales in dollars, well, that's going to be our sales price times our budgeted units, and then the commission will be a percentage of our sales commissions there. So to create our next formula, we go to the formulas menu, use in formula, we grab ending inventory, going to multiply that by the current month's budgeted sales. So that gives us that number. The required purchases in units is simple arithmetic, taking the total needs, subtracting the quantity that we presently have on hand. So that gives us that formula. Required purchases in dollars. What we need to do, if we go back to our inputs, we can see that there's a gross margin of 50%. So we need to take 1 minus that, multiply it by our sales price, and multiply that by the units we expect to sell. So instead of switching between tabs, we can again do this in place here. We can put an opening parenthesis, 1 minus. Go to use in formula, we choose gross margin, close those parentheses. Notice that most of the time, use in formula is going to be disabled for you because your spreadsheets won't have range names in them. Use in formula lights up whenever we've assigned names in our spreadsheet. So gross margin times our sales price times our number of units there. And so there's the number of units, there's our required purchases in dollars. So that's what we're going to spend on our purchases. Actually, I chose the wrong row, not B2, that's going to be B6. Because we're figuring out the cost of what we're going to buy. Now, the budgeted sales in dollars, that's going to be based on the budgeted sales in units. So here we can reference this cell, multiply by, then choose use in formula. So notice you can go back and reference use in formula as needed. There doesn't have to be any rhyme or reason, doesn't have to be the first part of the formula. You can just insert names just as you would insert cell references. In fact, these are cell references. They just point back to that specific spot. Another thing that using range names does for us is we don't have to worry about those pesky dollar signs. Because, for instance, let's say I've said equals this times, I go back to inputs, I click on the sales price. Actually, we'll just reference it this way. Let's say B3. So there's our formula presently. And that's going to work until we go and start dragging to the right. We end up with zeros. And why are we ending up with zeros? That's because the formula is drifting. It's referencing B2, B3, C3, D3, E3, F3, and so on. So that's why normally we'd have to come in here and put a dollar sign in front of the B and in front of the 3 there. And using range names frees us up from that because a range name, a named range, is a direct reference for that. We don't have to worry about any dollar signs. So we'll clear these formulas out and take another try at this. So what we'll do is we'll say equals B2 times, go to the formulas menu, choose use in formula, and then we will choose our sales price. So we'll see that formula we'll be able to copy to the right without having to put in any dollar signs. Now what we'll do, our sales commissions in dollars, we'll say that's our budgeted sales, multiply it by our commission rate, press enter, and so there we go, there's the new amount there. So now that I have those formulas in place, we can now fill them across the spreadsheet. So let me hide these comments. Notice that instead of copying over each one individually, which can feel like we're making some headway, that's really expending unneeded energy, we can just work our way down the column. And then I want to show you a keyboard shortcut we can use for filling things across to the right. So what we're going to do is we're going to select cell B5. We're going to hold down the Shift key while we use the arrow keys to select across to cell M9. So holding down the Shift key in conjunction with the arrow keys, much more effective way of selecting areas of the spreadsheet. Step 2 then shows that we can press Control-R. Control-R is a keyboard shortcut for copying data to the right. If we had data we wanted to copy down a column, we could use Control-D for that. So Control-D would take whatever's in the first cell and copy it down the column. In this case, Control-R takes whatever's in the first column in our selection, copies it across over to the right. So here we'll come across, we'll select this, we'll press Control-R, and that then fills that data going across to the right. We now need to create a way to perform an allocation. And so allocations can be particularly tricky. The allocation I need to do in this case is with regard to my sales. The assumption is I will collect 25% of the sales in the month of the sale, 50% the month after the sale, 25% the following month after that. So I need to create a means where I can take these sales amounts and break them down month by month to be able to get a total of what I will collect in any given month. Because when I get to March, I'll be collecting 25% of January and 50% of February, as well as 25% of March. So calculations like that can get a bit mind-bending, and folks often try to write these elaborate formulas and do it all in one place, when many times it's better to break it out into 2 different stages. So what we're first going to do is build out a grid where we will just use our collections and we'll just kind of stagger them across. So this top table is going to be the percentages. The bottom table we then use to calculate or derive the dollars that will be collected in each month. So there's different ways we could craft this, but we'll take a simple approach today. We're just going to say equals collections 1, equals collections 2, equals collections 3. Take those 3 cells, copy and paste them on a staggered basis all the way across the table there. So I mentioned that using formulas doesn't work, is not available in Excel for Mac, but you may not always want to use using formula. You may remember the name of the assumption. So another way that we can create a formula that has a named range is we can just start typing the name of the range. So if I type equals and I type the letter C, notice that Excel gives me a list of worksheet functions that start with the letter C. And if we look down at the bottom, it says collections 1. Well, let's keep on typing. Let's type an O. Notice the list got a little smaller, and then we're seeing collections. And then we type L. Well, type L. And here's collections 1. So at the point that it's highlighted where it says collections 1, you can press the tab key and then press enter. If I come along over here, I can type equals, start typing collections. Now I want collections 2 here, so I can use the down arrow and then the tab key. And then here I'll type collections, down arrow twice, tab key, enter. And so what we'll see is I'll have labeled all 3 cells there. So, or created all 3 formulas. So there's collections 1, collections 2, and then also collections 3. To then fill out the rest of the table, we'll select these 3 cells, we'll right click and we'll choose copy, and then we'll right click and we'll paste the formula. Notice that I don't have to worry about dollar signs again. And I also don't have to worry about the different cell addresses blurring here. By assigning names, I always stay in control. I'm not going to get confused about what I'm putting where. So here then, once we've got this, we can copy and paste, copy and paste, copy and paste. So I'm pressing Control C and Control V to do so. V is in Victor for pasting. And so we work our way across. We will find that we end up with some stray entries out to the right, and we can just go to the Home menu and use the Clear All command to erase those. So that sets us up with a set of percentages. And so in a moment, we'll talk about how to use these percentages to derive the dollars. Before then, I want to talk about a couple different worksheet functions. The first worksheet function I want to talk about is the choose function, and it has a place in budget spreadsheets because many times we'll have situations where, based on an input, if something is number 1, we want to use a certain name or amount. If it's number 2, we want to use a different name or amount, number 3, and so on. And so for those of us that aren't familiar with the choose function often rely on writing if statements. So we see that if I had a list of 1 through 4, and if I wanted, if cell A2 was equal to 1, I want to display the word apples. And if A2 is equal to 2, put the word oranges, otherwise put the word bananas, then I could craft that formula. And that's one of those formulas that works until it doesn't. Notice that once I drag it down far enough to row 5 where there's a 4 there, well, I didn't account for a 4th choice. And so my if function just says, well, we're going to display bananas because it's not a 1 or a 2, so that must mean you want bananas there. So creating nested if functions like that can be tricky. You can nest up to 64 if functions together. That is very much one of those not that you would, but you could kind of things. Strongly discourage trying to go that route. Whenever I find myself trying to nest together more than 2 or 3 levels of if functions, I can generally step back and find a better approach to take than trying to wrangle the if function. So the choose function is another tool for your toolbox where the arguments for the choose function, the first argument is an index number. That's going to be a number between 1 and 254. We can then list up to 254 items to the right of that, separated by commas, And where I have the word apples, oranges, and bananas, I could have just as easily put in numbers or formulas there. So this is not used just for referencing text. It's used for any kind of calculation or that I wish. And so notice that I put the choose function in cell C2, and then I drag it down the column. It returns the corresponding values. If it finds something I didn't account for on my list, I didn't add a fourth item, returns pound value, so it brings it to my attention. So if you need decision-making capabilities within your budget spreadsheets, this can then make that process easier. So what we'll do here, we'll go the nested if route first. We'll say if A2 equals 1, display the word apples. Then we'll do another if. So basically the if function has 3 arguments. It has a test that would equal true or false. There's a value of true. There's a value of false. So in the value of false, we can do another if. So if A2 equals 2, then the value of true would be oranges. The value of false would be bananas. And I could keep nesting more and more if functions in that fashion if I wish. So we'll press enter. We'll drag that down. Actually, the way I copied that down is I didn't drag it at all. I took my mouse and I double-clicked on the corner there. So when I double-click, it takes whatever's in this cell, copies it down to the bottom of that area of the spreadsheet. Here's where my error creeps in. So I'll show you the formula. And bananas isn't really what I want in this situation. That's actually an error that is easy to overlook because Excel is displaying something there. If I don't just happen to notice that that doesn't match, then that might slip through the cracks there. Conversely, with the choose function, this equals choose, reference this amount. So we display the word apples, oranges, bananas, copy that down. Notice that if choose encounters a problem, it brings it to your attention with a big pound value error. So you might have situations where there are different health plans. And so if somebody has plan number 1, it can be 1 premium, plan number 2, a different premium, plan number 3, a third one. Things like that are what the choose function is useful for, particularly if you would find yourself writing an if function along those lines. Now there's a different kind of if function that's particularly useful with budget spreadsheets, and that one is the sum if function. So what sum if lets us do is aggregate numbers together based upon criteria. And that can get us out of the business of having to write formulas where we add multiple cells together, like C7 plus C10 plus C14. Those plus, plus, plus formulas are really brutal to write, and they're brutal to audit. Another thing that makes them fragile is that if we set them up correctly the first time, if someone switches departments, then suddenly we have a situation where we have to go back in and rewrite the formula, or possibly 2 different formulas. Otherwise, we'll be referencing the wrong amounts. So the sum if function has 3 arguments. First argument is the range argument, and that's often referred to as where to look. So I want it to look at cells B2 through B16. Then there's a criteria argument where that's what am I looking for. So I want to look for whatever's in cell E2, which is the word police. And then there's a sum range, which in this case is C2 through C16. So what that means is that when looking at cell B2 through B16, if the word police shows up in that range, then we want to add up the corresponding values from column C. So that can give us our spreadsheet much better integrity so that we have a more resilient spreadsheet. Particularly, we're going to see if we switch somebody between departments, we'll find that sum if just updates itself automatically, whereas the old school formula, the plus, 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 will be returning an invalid value there. So we'll try our approaches here. We're going to say equals this cell plus that cell plus that cell. And rarely, if ever, will what you're trying to add up be color-coded for you. Usually you're looking at a big sea of numbers and trying to double, triple, quadruple check your work to make sure that you added everything up correctly. So that's some of the pain of that particular type of formula here. Conversely, we contrast that with the SUMIF function. So we're going to come along, we're going to select cells B2 through B16. Now, this is a formula I'm going to copy down the column there. And if I'm not careful about it, it's going to drift because B2 will become B3 and B16 will become B17 and so on. So what I need is a dollar sign in front of at least the 2 and the 16. Doesn't hurt in this context to put it in front of the B as well. So I could manually insert those dollar signs, or I could press the F4 key. So when I press the F4 key, it adds the dollar signs for me. Then I can go and select my criteria, which is the police department, and then I can specify the sum range. Now, I want to show you something tricky about the F4 key. I'm going to go ahead and close the parenthesis, and then I'm going to realize, oh, I didn't put the dollar signs. So I'm going to backspace, and I'm going to erase the dollar signs. And then I'm going to press the F4 key. And what I want you to notice is that in this context, it did not put dollar signs on both sides of the colon. It only put dollar signs on the right-hand side of the colon. And so that's a nuance that I need you to be aware of, because there's a window of time when you're writing formulas where the F4 key works exactly right. So let me erase this formula and just show you. So if we say SUMIF, as soon as we select a range of cells, our next action needs to be the F4 key. If we type anything else, a comma, a parenthesis, anything else, the window closes and the F4 key won't do its work effectively. So we then pick that. We then came along here, we type the parenthesis, then we're like, oh man, do I have to type those dollar signs manually? You don't necessarily. What you could do is you could click inside the function so that you can see the argument names. You can then click, in this case, on sum range. If it's highlight, then we press the F4 key, and then it adds the dollar signs there. So we press enter. That's that formula. We then drag that down, and notice that one, we're able to add up all these departments in one fell swoop, which we can't do with this plus 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 approach. But also, let's say that Bob switches to the police department. Now, all of a sudden, we've got an issue. This salary amount that we had is wrong because it's picking up an extra head count that it shouldn't have. So that's where manually adding things up makes our spreadsheets brittle versus being resilient and dynamic by using functions such as SUMIF. So we'll put him back. Notice everything flips back and is sorted out at the moment there. So that's the SUMIF function in its traditional use. I want to show you a different approach for using the SUMIF function, though, for calculating our dollars here. So you might think that we could just simply come up here and say, okay, I want these sales, I want to multiply it by that amount. And so if we were to take that and drag it across, the amount that we'd actually end up with is 123,000, which is not correct. What we're trying to do is we're trying to take this 120,000 and spread it across 3 months. The reason that we ended up with a different amount here is we're going to see there's B12, then C12, and then D12. So there's that drift coming into play again. Now, I could go in and put a dollar sign there, but then on each row, I'd have to go in and write the formula in that fashion. And anytime I find myself having to come along and do things on an individual basis for each cell there, that can cause its own separate issues. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the SUMIF function to find the values that we want. So instead of looking up and down a column, we're going to look across a row. So what we'll do here is where to look is going to look across row 25, where the months are. The criteria is going to be in column A, so whatever that month name is. So we do need a $ in front of that because I always want to lock into column A. The row number can drift. I do want the row number to change, but I don't want the column letter to change. My sum range in this case is going to be row 8. That's where my budgeted sales are. And so this gives me a formula. This is the gold standard. I can click in this cell, I can drag down, drag across, and I've filled in that part of the spreadsheet. So what we'll see here is we'll say equals sum if, and reference B25 through M25, press the F4 key, type a comma, click on January. Now, if you press the F4 key, the first time you press it, it puts a $ in front of the column letter and the row number. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go in and manually remove what you don't need. You can press the F4 key a second time, and it then removes the column $ and puts one just in front of the row. Press it a third time, puts it just in front of the column. Fourth time would remove all the $ completely. So this command, this keyboard shortcut is a toggle, so we can toggle our way to what we need, which is that. Then we go up and we want the sales amounts from row 8, press the F4 key, close our parentheses, and this amount we then multiply by our percentage there so that we're then able to take this formula, drag down, drag across, and notice that I have a concise and easy to audit allocation there where I had those amounts I need to stagger across multiple months, able to do that in one fell swoop here. For my total here, I can take this and I can click the auto sum button and then get a total of the amounts that I'm collecting on a monthly basis. Now, when I do use range names, I can often get some leverage out of it because remember we have the payment section too. So what I'll be able to do is copy these range names, paste them down here into this section. Now, those presently say collections 1, collections 2, collections 3, but I need to reference the payments section. So what I will do is select those cells, go to Find and Select, click the Replace command. I can tell it to replace the word collections with the word payment. I can say replace all. Now, when I'm doing an action like this, I need to be careful and make sure that I've isolated just the part of the spreadsheet where I want this replacement to occur. If I have only selected a single cell, it'll replace it across the whole worksheet. That's a situation where we're solving one problem and creating others accidentally. But I was mindful. I did go ahead and select. I have isolated where I want to search. I click Replace All, and in this case, I replaced it incorrectly. I said payment instead of payments. So we can undo that and put an S in here, say replace all. And so now it made those replacements. So if I update these formulas here, the captions, we'll see that it's payments 1, payments 2, payments 3. So you can get an economy of scale when you're using range names because, again, if I weren't, otherwise I'd have to go back in and rewrite all those formulas. That's where things grind to a halt because Excel's pushing folks around because they don't realize that there's other ways to accomplish things like that. So up here, we can copy our sum if. We can paste it down this section. Now, this section isn't going to reference row 8. It's purchases. It's going to refer to row 7 there. So all we have to do in our formula is where we said reference row 8, change that to a 7, press enter, and so we then drag down, we then drag across, and so we've now allocated our purchases in dollars there. So that builds out the supporting schedules worksheet. Before we move on from it, we are going to hide the formulas from the formula bar. And I'll show you why that's important to do so. We'll then also protect the worksheet itself. So to hide formulas in our spreadsheet, first step that we'll do is we'll go to the Find and Select command on the Home menu. Step 2, we're going to choose the Formulas command. That will select all the cells on the worksheet that have formulas. So that can be a useful audit step because once you've selected those cells, you can change the color of them if you want to be able to, at a glance, confirm that formulas are everywhere that you expect them to be. You could then undo that color change. But in this case, step 3, we're going to click on the arrow in the right-hand corner of the font section. That will bring up the Format Cells dialog box from which we'll choose the Protection tab. We'll click the hidden checkbox and then we'll click OK. Now that doesn't have any immediate effect on our spreadsheet. This is laying groundwork so that when we go and protect the worksheet, then when a user looks in on the formula bar, they won't be able to see the actual formula itself. Now why is that important? Let's go back and pull up that spreadsheet that had salary amounts. So we pull this up. So many times what we'd do is we would have the employees here, and then we'd have a summary on a different tab. So let's say that I take these formulas here, drag them over to the summary, and so what we think, what the thinking tends to be, is that we can right-click and we can choose Hide on the Employees tab. And so let me fix this. And so we then go to the Review menu and we say Protect Workbook. And we put in a password. And so then we think, okay, you can't insert any new sheets and you can't unhide anything, so we might think that that payroll data is protected. Well, here's the thing. If somebody can go in and see the name and see that there's an employee's worksheet in the workbook, even if we had this worksheet protected so they couldn't change this one, there's nothing that's going to stop somebody from opening up a brand new workbook. And then they can say equals and come over here and reference this workbook. And then what they're going to do is they're going to swap out where it says summary. They're going to put in the word employees because they learned it from the formula, and they'll put A1 and press enter. And I left out a single quote here. So let me put that single quote in. So there's my formula. And that employee data that I thought was so well protected, drag across, drag down, there's the payroll data. So that's why it can be important to hide the formulas so that users can't get at the sheet names. If they don't know the exact sheet name, they can't then pull data from the sheets that we've hidden. If they can see the sheet name, then folks that are savvy enough can then pull in the data that they want from these hidden sheets. So then to hide these formulas here, even though we're not referencing any payroll data presently, we'll go to the Home menu, we'll go to Find and Select. Coming down, we're going to choose the Formulas command. That selects all the cells in the spreadsheet that have formulas within them. On the Home menu, we'll choose the arrow for the Font section, brings up Format Cells, click on the Protection tab. In this case, Hidden was already turned on from previous class. Usually it's not turned on, and so it would be a setting that we would turn on and click OK. To actually then make the formulas vanish, the next step we will do is we'll go to the Review menu, and then we'll choose Protect Sheet. That brings up a Protect Sheet dialog box. We'll provide a password. We'll click OK. We'll re-enter our password. We'll click OK. At that point, if a user clicks on a cell that contains a formula, they won't see anything in the formula bar. So that can then protect sensitive data or calculations, what have you, in your spreadsheets. So what we'll do here then is we will go to the Formulas menu, actually the Review menu. We'll click Protect Sheet, give it a password. Click OK there. And so now this worksheet is protected. Users cannot type over the formulas, nor can they even see the formulas there in a traditional cell. So this will bring us to the operating budget. As I mentioned, we would be doing a lot of prep work. Prep work can feel tedious, but the investment pays off, because when you get to the home stretch where what you actually need to do is put together a budget, everything comes together easily because we've already put the numbers together. So what we'll do here is our purchases. That's on row 7 of the supporting schedules tab. We already derived that amount. So we'll just say equals supporting schedules minus B7. For our budgeted sales in dollars, that's on row 8. And then the commissions, that was on row 9. So on the operating budget for our sales, we'll say equals. We'll go and pick the sales figure there. And so that's that formula. Our purchases, we'll do an equal sign, and we'll choose the purchases, the commissions, grab our commission amount. So that's what those formulas look like. Now down here in this section, I want to write the sum function slightly different than you may have been doing it in the past. What many users do is shown in the first quadrant, top left, the top left section there, is they'll sum rows B4 and B5, which works until it doesn't. If a user inserts a new row above B4 or below B5, then those new amounts do not get included in the sum there. So this is where we want to build in that resilience so that if we do insert something, it gets included. So what that will look like is we'll select cell B7 of our operating budget worksheet. Step 2, we'll click the auto sum button, or we can press Alt equal. And when we do so, it will start the formula correctly. It's going to pick up that blank row and then the next 2 rows there, but it's not going to include the blank row above. But step 4 shows we can grab that little handle and drag it up to include cell B3, and then we'll have our formula that will sum those values. So here then what we'll do is we go to the home menu, we click the auto sum command. It gives you a preview there. So we drag up a notch, we then press enter. That's our formula, so that if we do insert something new and put in that amount, it gets picked up in the total there. So that's the resilience that we want. That's why we want to sum one row above and one row below the actual real data that we're summing. Our gross profit here is going to be the sales minus the cost of goods sold. So here for these formulas, we'll see again that we can select going across here and press Control R and fill the whole formula all the way across. So much easier just to focus on one column at a time rather than typing and dragging, typing and dragging, typing and dragging. That's distracting, keeps taking our focus off of our goal there. So that then brings us down to the operating expense section. That's that section that can be dynamic, and so we're going to see how our resilience is going to pay off here as well. So on the Inputs tab, we have the expense names. And what I want to encourage you to do, rather than having the user type those names in on the operating budget, instead create a formula that references back to those individual cells. That can help us in a couple ways. One, if a user changes the name of an expense on the Inputs tab, that change will then take effect on the operating budget tab at the same time. If you type in static values in both places, then it's easy for the worksheets to get out of step, and then confusion can arise because somebody changed the name of the account on the Inputs tab, but the budget shows something different. So we really want to have just centralized data entry there, and on the subsequent tabs, we don't want users changing anything. We want everything to be a reference back to the initial sheet. So that's how we're going to get the expense names in there. We'll do another sum here that sums one row up and one row below, and then our net income will just be a calculation there. Then we'll use the VLOOKUP function to fill in the actual expense amounts. So here what I will do is I'll click here or go to Inputs, and I'll just reference that first cell and drag that down. The reason that's important, if I come along and change this to payroll expenses, then on the operating budget, it changed automatically, so it stays in step there. So even though I don't have any data, I can go ahead and click on my auto sum. This time it overreached, it went too far up, so we're going to drag it back down so it's just summing one row above and one row below. And then here what we'll do is we'll say that minus that, so that will give us our net operating income number there. So then for the amounts themselves, the worksheet function we're going to use is the VLOOKUP function. If you're not presently using VLOOKUP in your spreadsheets, then there's much that you're having to do the hard way because you're having to go and directly reference amounts and words and so on that you want, as opposed to instructing Excel to go find it. So the VLOOKUP function has 4 arguments. The first argument is a lookup value argument. And that's just like the criteria argument for SUMIF. Basically, what are we looking for? So I'm looking for whatever is in cell A10. Where am I looking? That's the table array. And in this case, I actually do have a table that I'm referencing, which is called expenses, but I don't have to use tables with VLOOKUP. I could go and point it to a range of cells, but VLOOKUP performs much better if we do pair it with a table, as we're going to see, because normally if I had said, instead of putting the word expenses, if I had said inputs A17 through B19, and then later on I add some new expenses, I'd have to go back in and rewrite that formula to see those additional rows. The table feature takes it out of play because the table expands automatically. And also, by being able to use the name of the table, I then know at a glance what I'm looking at that part of the spreadsheet. So VLOOKUP looks down the first column of the table array, which in this case is my expenses table. And once it finds a match, it's going to travel across that row, and it needs to know, okay, what column do I stop on to return a piece of data? And that's what the column index number is. I want to return data from the second column. The fourth argument, if you already know VLOOKUP, you're probably presently typing the word false at the end to signify that you want an exact match. You can instead put a 0. 0 and false are interchangeable. Both of them signal that we want VLOOKUP to perform an exact match. Now I'm going to write this formula, and I'm going to do it the wrong way on purpose so that you can be aware of another nuance that we need to realize. So what we'll do is we'll say equals VLOOKUP. Going to click on cell A10. Now, if we went to use in formula, unfortunately, table names don't show up on the list there. However, I can type my table name. If I type an E, that gives me a list of worksheet functions and range names that start with E. Type the letter X, list gets smaller. Type letter P as I type expenses. At some point, I get to a point where I can just press the Tab key, finish it out. I want data from the second column, and then I want a 0 for an exact match. So that looks up that amount, and we copy that down, and it looks up those amounts. Here's where things go sideways. We select across here, we do Control-R, and then we end up with a bunch of pound NAs. Now, what has happened here is we didn't put a $sign in front of the column A because that's my lookup value, which means in column C, it starts looking to column B for the lookup value, and then column C, and so on. When VLOOKUP cannot find a match, it returns pound NA. So what we're going to see here is what I needed to do is put a $sign in front of the A. So then we double click to copy that down, Control-R to copy to the right, then it works properly. So when you're creating a VLOOKUP that looks across a range of cells, pay particular attention to the dollar signs, otherwise the cell references will start to drift and then your formula won't return the result that you want. So here then down here I can come across and I can do Control R. I will show you one other trick that I can do here. I have these totals. I'm going to click on the first cell, hold down the Shift key, selecting these cells where I want to put the totals. I can use the Auto Sum button there as well. Notice that it then instantly filled in the totals all the way down. So instead of having to go write totals cell by cell, I can hold down the Control key, select the cells I want, do Auto Sum, and it fills in those. Now, with regard to seeing resilience in our spreadsheet, we're going to go back to the Inputs tab. We're going to add a new expense. We're going to add a cell phone expense. We're going to find that the table feature expands automatically. To update my budget spreadsheet, all I'll have to do is right-click on row 13, choose Insert, copy row 12, and paste it into cell A13, and everything will update itself automatically. I will not have to go back in and rewrite any formulas. I won't have to write any formulas at all. It'll just take care of it all in one fell swoop. So here we go to our Inputs tab. Let's add cell phone, and it's 500. So the table feature grows automatically as we add data adjacent to it. To update the operating budget, we'll right-click here, we'll choose Insert, and then we'll come up here, we'll grab row 12, we'll copy row 12, we'll paste it onto the next row down. Cell phone appears automatically, the amounts are looked up, everything updated automatically, and so I can then rest assured that I can focus on adding content as opposed to having to always second guess, are my formulas working correctly here in this case. So once again, what we'd want to do with this part of the spreadsheet is go and hide the formulas. So the way we did that was find and select, we chose formulas. We click on the alignment section. We can actually do any of these first three. What we're looking for is format cells. So we can go to protection, click the hidden checkbox, click OK. From there, we can then go to the review menu, click protect sheet, click OK. There then we have the budget spreadsheet all nailed down. I see we had a question about VLOOKUP. Would the F4 key have worked for cell A10? It absolutely would have. And so anytime that you want to put the dollar signs in there, so if we went back here to our formula, so if we came back to our VLOOKUP, and let me unprotect the sheet now. So what I could have done is said equals VLOOKUP, reference this cell, press the F4 key. So the first time it would put in a dollar signs on both sides in front of the column and the row. Now I don't want one in front of the row, so I press F4 again, it puts it just in front of the row. Press it the third time, well, I tapped too many there. If I tap F4 3 times, then it gets in the right spot. So yes, you very much can use the F4 key anywhere that with any of these formulas to do so. It gets easy to, the reason I did it the wrong way is it's easy to get focused on a certain thing, forget the dollar signs, and then when you copy across, you end up with a bunch of pound and A errors. All right, well, this brings me to the end of my prepared comments for today, so I'm going to turn the floor back over to Sharif to manage our Q&A portion of our presentation.
Thank you, David. Attendees, Q&A has begun, and if you have any